Hi, this PowerPoint is about World War I, and I have to give all the credit to Michael Hadj for creating this PowerPoint. It was the basis of his inquiry project a couple of years ago. Now I have edited it to get rid of the stuff that isn't relevant and just to give it more of an emphasis that is more useful to you, but most of the work is his, so thank you, Michael. It also means one or two points he's got in here I'm not absolutely clear about, so I will signal them if they come up. World War I, how much was it a cause of the Russian Revolution? Michael's question was about the significance of World War I as a cause of the revolution, and he came to the conclusion that it was relevant for four reasons. That World War I actually prepares Russia for revolution because it, one, casts a harsh light on the ineptitude and failings of Tsar Nicholas and his regime. Two, it deals a devastating impact on the economy. Three, it opened up the regime to the criticism of the people who could see, reflect upon and talk about the ineptitude of the regime. And four, but it empowered the Bolsheviks. So let's have a look at how he unpacks these four ideas. All right, why did Russia get involved in the war in the first place? Well, Russia was an empire, and a central idea to the concept of empire is expansion, glory, proving your power. Russia, remember, had just been recently humiliated by the Russo-Japanese War in 1904-1906. So here it is, 1914. Here's a chance to prove that Russia is, in fact, a great and glorious empire and achieve some restoration of national pride. Nothing like a war to unify people, and if there's anything Russia needs right now, it's a bit of unification. So war might provide that opportunity to restore people's confidence in the Tsar, in the Tsarist regime, and in Russia as a whole. There's also the concept of romanticism and Napoleon. Now, I'm not exactly sure what Michael means here, but I'm guessing that the example of Napoleon and the French Revolution would have been in Nicholas's mind. Look how Napoleon proved to be this great hero of the people by leading his country to a glorious military victory. So I think Nicholas might have had these romantic notions in his head that if he could just prove to his people what a great leader he was, bring them glory, victory, pride, then he would be like Napoleon. There's nothing like a war to distract people, if it's successful and if everyone's going off to fight patriotically, to distract them from their more mundane domestic grievances and concerns. So we need to consider the circumstances of Europe at the time, a transitioning time, an unstable time, a time where some countries are modernising rapidly, Russia is left behind. Russia is in a period of volatility. There's a lot of discontent and a lot of revolutionary mumblings, and Nicholas's actions here are going to be decisive in determining what happens in the future. So, high stakes. That means it's a huge risk. It's a huge risk to enter this war. If things go well, the regime is going to perhaps survive the instability and discontent at home. But if not, if the war goes badly, this could be the end of the Romanov regime. Peter Dernova, I think that's how you pronounce it, has said this: if the war fared poorly, a social revolution in its most extreme form will be unavoidable in Russia. So this is a primary source quote predicting if the war goes badly, there will be a revolution. Rodzienko, we've heard his name before. He's a leader of, is it the SRs? Check in your notes which party Rodzienko belonged to. But he is saying at this point, the Romanov dynasty, the future of the Romanov dynasty is being decided in this war. At first, the war, the mobilisation of soldiers for war, the equipping of them, the sending them off with fife and drum and trumpet, meant there was a huge burst of patriotic support. And at first, the war goes very well. There is a unifying and a patriotic outflow at the start of the war. But when things begin to go badly, which they do, Nicholas assumes the role of commander. Somewhere else he referred to in that quote about he was never going to reform the nation or offer any form of democracy because these were his children, that God had given him the responsibility of the Russian people as his children. And so going off to be the commander of the war, it's not about whether he's a great military trained leader, far from it, but these are his people, these are his people, and he will lead them if they're going to war, for better or worse, whether he has the skills or not. Here is a photograph of Nicholas with some wounded soldiers, and you can see the grim determination in his face as he sits there amongst his wounded children. I'm really sorry about my phone going mad. I should have turned it off. Now, what happens is the ineptitudes and failings of the Tsar and the regime are exposed by the war. The war goes badly. The Russian army is ill-equipped. The German army is modernised, well-equipped, well-trained, and they decimate the Russians. In battle after battle, the Russians are slaughtered. The Michael Hadj has said ineptitude of the Russian army is exposed. Part of this is because the leaders of the Russian army, the generals, are usually in that position because of their birth into a noble family or a wealthy family, not because they're great military leaders. Now, there were some. Brusilov is a good general, but many of the leaders, many of the officers are there because of their birth, not because of their leadership skills, and the soldiers can see that. Nicholas is also a bit of a twit, and he is so confident of his ability to make a good decision and be a good leader that he often would override the decisions of his generals and ignore their military advice. Even though they know what they're doing, they're better trained than him, he ignores them. General Brusilov, the one I said before, was actually a good general. He criticised the management of the war, calling the Tsar a bastard. He said he was never able to find out anything about the general plan or campaign of the war, as if there was no plan, that Nicholas was making it up as he went along. And he said that even the decision to enter the war was an ill-conceived decision. So 2 million soldiers die, 14 are conscripted and 2 million die. That's an attrition rate of 15%, which is extraordinary. All sorts of reports come back from the front line saying that things are bad in the front line. There is huge mistrust of the leaders. The soldiers are mutinying. The soldiers are grumbling. There's lack of confidence in not just in their local leaders, like their officers, but in the entire leadership of the army and the country. The soldiers aren't fed enough. They're cold. They don't have proper weapons. They are weary of the war and they want out. Now, the devastation to the economy is also extraordinary. War requires money, and war can generate profit, but not when you don't have the industry to back it up. So it costs the war costs Russia about 1.5 billion rubles in expenditure. The way to get that money is, remember France, increased taxation and borrowing from foreign countries. These are not good strategies long term. There are food shortages because why should the peasants break their backs producing grain when it all just gets sent off to the army and they don't get paid properly for it? There's no money to build into the infrastructure, into the industry and the train lines and the vehicles and everything that the war needs. And so all that deteriorates and things break and don't get fixed and equipment has to be abandoned and the communications isn't great, and all these things start to break down. How do you solve the problem of needing more money? Well, you just print more money. It's a very, very short-term solution, but you know from France and the decrease in the value of the assignat. Remember in France, well, the same thing happens here with the ruble. They had 11 times. They printed the amount of money that had been in circulation at the start of the war. They printed it 11 times over. And 41.2% of the war is financed by paper money. And if paper money is being overly produced, it's going to lose its value and you end up with this massive inflation. So there's peasants can't afford to buy anything, but there's no goods anyway. So even if they wanted to buy something, there's nothing available. Everyone is suffering. Consider too that millions of men are rounded up, put into uniforms and sent off to fight the war, taking them out of industry. So there's no one to fill their jobs and keep producing the goods that are needed to run a war. So we have this awful catch-22 situation. We need men for the front, but we need men for industry. Well, let's just take them out of industry and send them off to the front where they'll die in their minions. Women weren't completely able to fill the gaps in the industry left behind because women weren't educated. And they weren't trained in those industries. So while they could fill some holes in the labour shortage, they couldn't fill them all. Now, it was Robert Service has said that war was bound to accentuate the defects in the economy. The economy already had problems. The war exacerbated those problems and exposed them. All right, so war sours public opinion against Nicholas and damages the national psyche. People turn against the Tsar. People are humiliated and infuriated and grief-stricken by the war, the loss of life in the war, and their loss of confidence in the reasons why they're fighting the war, and their loss of confidence in the leadership that are fighting the war. So this prompted people to turn away from the Tsar and the idea of the absolute autocrat, realising that this is not a good system, it's flawed, it doesn't serve their interests, it doesn't meet their needs. And so if there was any doubt before the war really just turns people away from the Romanov regime in massive numbers. His conservatism, his refusal to acknowledge that there's anything wrong with the Romanov regime and the Tsardom and the system exacerbates this problem. He just is stubbornly determined to maintain that role of, the Tsar as it's always been. He still believes he's been called by God to this role and that he shouldn't change it, can't change it, won't change it. There are a whole lot of telegrams from the front line that's still in existence, primary source documents showing that significant men in the inner circle, the Tsar's advisors, are furious with him, that they are just exasperated. They're at their wits' end. They don't know what to do with the Tsar. They don't know how to get him to listen to them. There are lots of reports of mutinying in the army, refusal to obey their officers, discontent, threats to walk away. There is a general mood of down with the war and down with the Tsar. Now, how do the Bolsheviks maximise this for their own benefit? Well, they begin denouncing the war. They are the only party that actually come out and say, we are against the war. If there's a revolution and we get to take power, we will get out of the war immediately. This is very, very attractive. The Bolsheviks work really, really hard at the front line, along the lines of the war, spreading Bolshevik ideology amongst the soldiers, winning many, many soldiers to their cause. They talk about reparation to families who have lost soldiers. They talk about the war as being an immoral war, a predatory and imperialist war, and that the Russian working class and the Russian peasants have no reason to be fighting against German workers and peasants. That this is a war where the proletariat are being used as cannon fodder for the ambitions of leaders. That's their real enemy, not each other. Russian workers should not be fighting German workers. They have more in common than they have, in enmity. So what happens is these ideas are very attractive. These ideas spread rapidly. The Bolsheviks are saying we need to get out of this war at any price. We should just, give Germans just surrender. Get into peace negotiations. At any price. It doesn't matter. We've just got to stop this fighting. And there's a lot of attraction between the burnt-out, stale, old regime of the Romanovs and this young, fresh Bolshevik ideology that offers change and offers a solution to their problems. Now, Beckett has summed this up. A great quote. Make sure you memorise this quote. He says this: "It is difficult to conceive of communism triumphing but for the impact of the First World War on the Russian state." So he's saying the Bolsheviks would never have got to power had it not been for World War I. Now, that's a pretty juicy quote to use. Now, there is some historical debate around this. This is the Communist Party of the Soviet Union have said, what was the role of World War I? Well, it primed Russia for the imminent outbreak of a popular revolution that would reject Tsardom. So they're saying there was going to be a revolution anyway. There was a popular revolution boiling away, bubbling away. It would have broken out, but World War I primed Russia. It got Russia ready for that revolt. We've got the quote from the previous slide. It's difficult to conceive of communism triumphing except for World War I. But there is some debate over how culpable the Tsar was. How much is it his fault? Robert Service says disruption would have occurred in the economy whichever political group, whether liberal or socialist, had been in charge of the war. Wars create social problems. Wars create discontent and loss of life. And it's going to be hard. It's not really so much the Tsar's fault. That's a problem with any war. And then Pipes argues, in a similar vein, the pressures generated by World War I, rather than the flawed Tsarist regime, caused people to look to the radical left. So it was a result of war rather than Nicholas. And Robert Service again says, war was bound to accentuate the defects in the economy. It's not really adequate to be just saying, well, the Tsar's a twit. What do you think? When you are writing about historical perspectives, you are meant to demonstrate your ability to evaluate them. So here are some language tips that when you're writing in your essay, in a few weeks' time for your outcome, and you're talking about historical perspectives, you can be using language like this. That should be the CPSU, that's a typo. The CPSU overcredits this. It gives too much weight to something. Pipes ignores some particular evidence. Service underestimates the impact of. Beckett correctly concludes that. While Wade downplays something, he places more emphasis on something else. So you can see how these sort of sentence fragments are using the kind of language that means that you are evaluating what the historians are saying rather than just repeating them. You're not using the historians, just as this person says it better than I can. You're actually evaluating and weighing up what the historians say and choosing some to support your interpretation while you criticise the conclusions of others based on, well, they're not crediting the evidence that I think is really important. Right? So that's just a little tip for writing. And here is Michael Hadj's final conclusion. It ties in with his hypothesis at the start. It's a bit wordy, so concentrate, but here is his conclusion. World War I certainly prepared Russia for the Bolshevik Revolution because it was an unpopular event that cast a harsh light on Tsar Nicholas and his regime, dealt devastation to the Russian economy, and, by the regime opening itself up to public political scrutiny, called into question the existing power structures in Russia. It was from this climate of turmoil that Russia's only anti-war party, the Bolsheviks, were turned to in a time in which people were desperate, sought to abandon the war, and were in search of change. And that's a pretty substantial conclusion about the contribution of World War I to the Russian Revolution. His next statement is his colloquial summary, which, while very descriptive, is not something you should be quoting in your essays. I hope that's been helpful. Look to Schoology now for instructions of what to do with this information.